Hello, everybody. Welcome to the show today. This is Uncontrolled Opposition. I am Jayme CheeseSlice, the engineer and producer for the show today. And we've got a good one about LBJ and a lot of his crimes. So, if this is the first time you've ever watched this show, we are a radio show first and foremost. We are on WBAI and the Progressive Radio Network. And we just do our recording session here live on YouTube for you guys to watch, and you get to see how the sausage is made, and it's all live and uncut. So without further ado, let's go ahead and bring on Gloria and Jayme. How are you guys doing today?
Hey, Jayme.
Um, I think we just need to jump right into this and get started. So we'll go ahead and bring on our guests, Robert and Matt. And unfortunately, Matt's camera's not working, but I think we can make do with that. So, Gloria, if you're ready, we'll go ahead and get started.
All right. Hey, everyone. Welcome to Uncontrolled Opposition, where together we battle mind wars with truth strikes. I'm Gloria Guillo, an investigative journalist, and I'm here with my co-host, Professor Jeremy Kuzmarov, managing editor of Covert Action magazine. Our producer and engineer is Jayme CheeseSlice. The opinions you hear are ours and that of our guests, not those of WBAI, the Pacifica Foundation, or the Progressive Radio Network. This content is intended for informational and educational purposes only and should not be interpreted as professional or legal advice. Listeners are encouraged to form their own opinions. Today's guests are noted experts on the forensics of President Kennedy's murder and Lyndon B. Johnson. Today, we welcome back independent investigative journalists and authors Robert Morrow and M.C. Armstrong. When you strip away the gore and the sensationalism, the accusation against Lyndon Johnson is brutally simple. He was willing to remove anyone who threatened his rise to power, and the ultimate obstacle was John F. Kennedy himself. The core claim is that LBJ used his Texas machine, men like Cliff Carter and Malcolm Mack Wallace, to eliminate problems. A federal investigator looking too closely at Johnson's financial bagman, Billy Sol Estes, ended up dead, ruled suicide despite overwhelming questions. Years later, Estes testified under oath that the order came straight from Lyndon Johnson himself. Mack Wallace, a convicted killer who somehow walked free after murdering a romantic rival, allegedly leaves a fingerprint in the Texas School Book Depository, a building conveniently owned by Johnson's closest oiled baron, Fred D.H. Byrd. Then comes the voices from inside the system. CIA officer E. Howard Hunt on tape before he died, placing LBJ at the very top of the chain of command for Dallas. Jack Ruby in 1965 telling reporters on camera that the man in office now orchestrated the whole thing. JFK's personal secretary, Evelyn Lincoln, writing on November 22nd, 1963, while still in the air returning from Dallas, number one suspect, Lyndon. Even a 1966 FBI memo relaying that the KGB, after exhaustive analysis, concluded the same. No other president has ever faced that kind of chorus from intelligence operatives, mob figures, and personal aides, all naming him for the murder of his predecessor. And yet, Lyndon Johnson is hardly alone in the rumor mill of convenient deaths. The Clintons carry a decades-long shadow, former associates dying in small plane crashes, apparent suicides, and contested evidence. A DNC staffer gunned down on a Washington street while his laptop vanishes into FBI custody. The list is so long, it became its own dark internet meme. Barack Obama has a shorter version. 3 members of his Chicago church choir gone in rapid succession years ago. And more recently, his personal chef, an excellent swimmer, drowning in shallow water off Martha's Vineyard under circumstances quiet enough to fuel endless speculation. The pattern repeats. Powerful presidencies attract premature deaths the way magnets attract iron filings. Some are tragic coincidences, some are genuine mystery, and a few cross the line into something sinister. But Lyndon Johnson's accusations remain in a league of their own, not because of the body count, but because of who the primary body was, the President of the United States. And because the people pointing the finger weren't random conspiracy theorists, they were the men who ran the bags, pulled the triggers, and sat in the room when the orders were allegedly given. 62 years later, the official story still says one man acted alone in Dallas. The darker story says the man who benefited most had spent his entire political life proving he would do whatever it took to sit behind the resolute desk. Maybe that's why the JFK case refuses to stay buried, because even if a fraction of what those insiders claimed is true, then the 36th president didn't just inherit the Oval Office. He murdered his way to get into it. Thank you. To start off, Matt and Robert, please tell us about yourselves and why you each independently found it necessary to study LBJ.
Go ahead, Matt.
All right, I'll start this conversation, and thank you, Gloria. Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you, Jayme, and thank you, Rob, for being here. I'll start this with a conversation that Robert and I had a number of years ago. I had just published a review of Josiah Thompson's Last Second in Dallas in the Brooklyn Rail, and it was a book about the forensic evidence supporting the idea of a conspiracy in JFK's murder. And the point that Thompson makes is that the evidence is irrefutable at this point. And shortly after I published it, Robert got my phone number, gave me a call, and he said to me, well, you do know that Lyndon Johnson murdered John F. Kennedy, don't you? And he said a couple other things too, but I won't put those on the air. And I said, I'm not sure about that. You know, I'm not convinced at this point. I was one of these guys who was playing it safe at that point. And that was just a few years ago, regularly arguing that the CIA killed JFK. And I think the CIA does have equities in this case. But I hadn't really come to the conclusion that Johnson was a decisive participant or even potentially the orchestrator. Well, then Robert said to me, I want you to do me one favor. I want you to read the most authoritative biography, the first volume, the most authoritative biography on Lyndon Johnson. That's Robert Caro's Path to Power. And I want you to tell me, after reading that, if you don't see the portrait of a psychopath capable of murder. And if you don't see that, don't call me back. But if you do, I've got some files I'd like you to take a look at. And so I read it. And I think anybody who does that work will see that Johnson does have that profile and that he is a man capable of murder. And the deeper you get into Caro, you start to ask the question that a lot of us have been asking recently. Why doesn't LBJ's most esteemed biographer make the same arguments that Gloria, you just made so persuasively at the beginning of this show, when there's such a mountain of evidence to indict Johnson? Why do our most esteemed JFK and LBJ historians like Michael Beschloss, Ken Burns, soon to be a PBS historian of LBJ, Robert Caro, why do we dodge this American elephant in the room? And to set Robert up a little bit and to set this conversation up a little bit, I'd like to expand the conversation beyond JFK so we can make that more persuasive case. There are all of these other murders that Johnson is on the hook for, according to not just Billy Celestes, but many others. And I think the great place to start today, and Robert, you take it another direction if you want, but I think we ought to start with the murder of Henry Marshall, the USDA investigator who was killed on June 3rd, 1961. And it was initially labeled a suicide, even though, guess how many bullets they found in Mr. Marshall? 5. Have any of these listeners out there today, have any of you guys ever heard of a 5-bullet suicide before? I thought that'd be a great name for a punk band. 5-bullet suicide. Go ahead, Robert.
And if I can just briefly interject, perhaps, Robert, you could also, maybe we should start and definitely go into Henry Marshall, the killing of Sam Smithwick and the 1948 rigged election in Texas. So go ahead, Robert.
Okay, I'll be lightning quick for the listeners. What it is that before Lyndon Johnson orchestrated the murder of John Kennedy, he was killing people down in Texas, people who were a threat to him, people who were a threat to expose his many, many crimes, whether they were voting fraud or massive kickbacks of cash from Billy Solestis. So LBJ's first victim is a guy named Sam Smithwick, and he was murdered in the spring of 1952 because he had written a letter to Coke Stevenson, who was the former governor of Texas, who LBJ had beaten in the 1948 Democratic primary for U.S. Senate. And the way LBJ beat Coke Stevenson for that Senate race was with massive voter fraud down in South Texas, and including in San Antonio, where they probably just manufactured an astronomical 35,000 votes out of thin air for LBJ. So LBJ illegitimately won the 48 Democratic nomination for U.S. Senate. And back then, the Democratic nominee was a sure thing, a lead pipe cinch to beat the Republicans in the fall. And that's exactly what LBJ did. So Sam Smithwick in spring of 52 wrote a letter to Coke Stevenson. And he says, hey, I want you to come visit me, and I want to tell you how LBJ stole the election from you in 1948. Come visit me in prison in Huntsville, Texas. And within 11 days, Sam Smithwick was found hung on his bed. He had a bunk bed, and he has a rope around his neck or a sheet or whatever while he's sitting on the floor, and he's dead. And that letter from Smithwick to Coke Stevenson got published in newspapers all across Texas. And I guarantee you, Lyndon Johnson was freaking out. And so I think Lyndon Johnson murdered Smithwick in prison, and so did the governor of Texas, Governor Alan Shivers, who was a right-wing Tory Democrat. And he even told that to people. And the reason we know that Shivers thought that is because Lyndon Johnson told this to journalist Ronnie Duggar in the White House in the 1960s, that Shivers said I was a murderer. Shivers said I killed this guy. Shivers said I was a murderer. That's how we know about this in the first place. And then Ronnie Duggar went to Alan Shivers and says, do you have any comment on this? And he said, no comment on what you're asking about me. And he didn't deny it. No comment. So how would LBJ have killed Smithwick? It's very easy. You know, it's like Jeffrey Epstein got killed in prison. Okay. It wasn't Hillary Clinton that murdered Jeffrey Epstein in prison. The top two perps for murdering Jeffrey Epstein in prison they have their two names. They're the people who controlled that prison. Donald Trump and William Barr, the Attorney General. Okay. So the way you kill a person in prison is very easy. Anybody who deals with the prison system knows how incredibly corrupt it is. It's a very, very dangerous place. And every prison is run by a warden. And if you get the warden involved, he can get a prisoner or a prison guard to murder anybody in that prison at any time. They just turn the cameras off, clear out the area, and send in the murderer, a big, strong guy who can easily overwhelm a Jeffrey Epstein or a Sam Smithwick. So I think LBJ got a hold of Sam Smithwick's letter to Coke Stevenson, because when you mail stuff out of the prison, they read it. When stuff goes into the prison, they read it. And so when they found out that Smithwick was writing a letter to Coke Stevenson, going to talk about LBJ's voter fraud, I feel sure that LBJ cronies in the prison system alerted him to this, and the order went out to kill Sam Smithwick ASAP, and they did. And the governor of Texas believed that. Okay, that's in 1952. In the spring of 52, another thing happened. Was an LBJ patronage employee named Mac Wallace, who had been working in the Department of Agriculture, went into court in Austin, Texas, after blatantly murdering a man named John Kinzer, who'd been having sex with Wallace's wife. Wallace, on October 22nd of 1951, walked into the Butler Pitch and Putt golf course, went to the golf pro shop, pulled out his gun, and murdered a man in cold blood. And he walked to his car, and the golfers saw the gun in his hand, and they read the license plate on his car. And he was arrested within 30 minutes on BK's Road. Maybe 30, not very far. He didn't get very far. And so he goes on trial. He's obviously guilty, and he's convicted of murdering John Kinzer. Convicted. I want folks to know that in Austin, Texas, Mac Wallace was convicted in February of 52 for killing a man. And then the judge, who's under the thumb of Lyndon Johnson and his crony Ed Clark, gives him a sentence of 5 years probation, no time in jail. That's unheard of. That's on a conviction, not on acquittal. See, back then you could kill if you walked in on your wife having sex with the mailman or the milkman, and you just lost your mind and you killed the milkman or whatever, or the mailman. A jury might acquit you under crimes of passion and say, okay, well, you just lost your mind. It's a crime of passion. You're really not a bad person. You just went crazy for 2 or 3 seconds and you're innocent. Well, Mac Wallace was convicted of murder, and an LBJ judge let him out of jail with 5 years probation, no time in jail. So that's in 52. So Jeremy asked about Sam Smithwick getting killed in prison. That's LBJ. Mac Wallace killed a man and got out of jail scot-free. That's LBJ. Then you go to 1961. What's going on then? Can I keep filibustering, folks?
And then he used Wallace as his hitman. Since he had him under his control, he could get him to do all his dirty work right after. And he gave him a security clearance to work for, was it Lim Tenkovat? Somehow this guy, a convicted murderer, got a top security clearance.
Yeah. Well, so Mac Wallace later goes to work for LBJ crony D.H. Byrd. That is an oil man and a defense contractor who made a ton of money off the Vietnam War, who also
and the owner of the Texas School Book Depository.
Yeah, and people don't know this. LBJ's best friend owned the Texas School Book Depository building and hired LBJ's convicted murderer and gave him a job. And then
just for a point of information, tell our audience the significance of the book depository.
Yeah, I mean, this is when people talk about the forensic evidence indicting Lyndon Johnson in the JFK assassination. Is there anything larger than the ostensible crime scene being owned by one of Lyndon Johnson's best friends, an oil tycoon named D.H. Byrd? This is the Byrd who was a member of the famous Byrd political family that I grew up with in Winchester, Virginia. I went to school with the Byrds. Think Harry Byrd, think the Dixiecrats. We forget that before Lyndon Johnson became the great white savior of the civil rights movement, he was a good pal of Strom Thurmond and a Dixiecrat himself, a friend of the Byrds writ large, but most importantly, a friend of D.H. Byrd, the owner of the JFK murder crime scene.
Well, not only that, as we discussed a few months ago, D.H. Byrd took out the sniper's window from the Texas School Book Depository building and took it home and displayed it as a memento. But not only that, Byrd, LBJ's friend and pal and buddy and chum, who made a ton of money off the Vietnam War, took out the furthest westernmost window on the 6th floor. That has been documented to have been wide open, completely wide open at the time of the JFK assassination. That's critically important. If you look at photos or the Bell film that was taken, at the exact time of the assassination, the western window, not the eastern so-called Oswald window, where Oswald was not sitting, by the way, it's the western window that had shooters. And probably there was a shooter in the eastern window too, not named Oswald. Byrd knew enough to take out the western window. That's a documented fact.
And 5 witnesses, Robert, correct me if I'm wrong, but 5 witnesses that day on 11/22/63 identified a man in that window with glasses.
There was
the most distinctive feature of Mac Wallace.
Yes. Well, Bob Jackson, the reporter for one of the local newspapers or TV stations, he said, I saw somebody in the westernmost window. The window that Byrd took out, not the propaganda window that Oswald was not sitting in. Maybe somebody else was. I kind of think there was a shooter in the furthermost eastern window, or somebody is sticking a gun out the window. Okay. So what are we getting at? We're saying Lyndon Johnson used his friend D.H. Byrd's building to murder John Kennedy, and he also had somebody out there on the grassy knoll. And these people, in my opinion, would be anti-Castro Cubans and people affiliated with the United States military and the CIA.
Now, okay. Robert and I differ on this a little bit, but I think there was a shooter in the Dow Tex building as well.
Well, that's fine.
That's also argues that.
Well, that's a minute point of difference, and we're going to have lots of points of differences, but we're united, and Lyndon Johnson put those shooters there, right?
I think that's right.
Yeah. And so we get to the Henry Marshall murder. That was the original question. People are saying, well, what is all this about? Google it. Google Henry Marshall murder, Henry Marshall, Spartacus Educational, and you'll read a bio on him and his murder. Henry Marshall was an East Texas U.S. agricultural official who was investigating Billy Saul Estes, LBJ's massive cash cow machine. Billy Saul Estes later said he gave Lyndon Johnson $10 million. And that's in money from the 1950s and 60s. That's like $100 million in today's dollars in cash. And he would fly to LBJ Ranch and give him a suitcase full of money anytime Lyndon Johnson wanted that. So if you're investigating Billy Saul Estes, you're also investigating Lyndon Baines Johnson. And LBJ could not tolerate that. And so while he's the vice president, he orchestrates the murder of Henry Marshall. Billy Saul Estes said, LBJ said, get rid of him. Now, Jeremy says, was Mac Wallace used to murder him? Well, that comes out of the mouth of Billy Saul Estes. We can't trust him. Maybe he was, maybe he wasn't. I kind of think Billy Saul Estes and his own brother murdered Henry Marshall on his ranch. Or maybe some other LBJ directed assassin. I'm not so sure it was Mac Wallace. The only person who said that originally is Billy Saul Estes. He's not a credible person. He's a liar. He's a crook. He's LBJ affiliated. We can't trust him on that. But maybe Mac Wallace did. Okay.
So I think when you talk about the credibility of Billy Saul Estes, I think the only way we can kind of credibly corroborate him or bring up his charges is when we find other sources backing him up. And when it comes to the Kennedy assassination, I was like Joan Mellon. I was very skeptical of Estes's claims. And then as Gloria brought up in her introduction, here in 2025, we have the Cliff Carter tape where we see it's not just Estes, but the former head of the Democratic National Committee, Cliff Carter, in conversation with Estes, talking about Johnson as the orchestrator of not only the Kennedy assassination, but multiple other murders. And the Marshall murder is one, and I know we don't have a lot of time today, but we've also got the murder of Estes' associates, George Krudelek,
sure,
Harold Orr, Coleman Wade, right? There is this long laundry list. And well beyond those, there are others who would put the murders of Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy around Johnson's neck like an albatross. I don't know if we want to go into Coleman Wade, George Krudelek, or Harold Orr or Martin Luther King, but there is a pattern, and Estes is not the only one making these arguments. For example, with Martin Luther King, we have Martin Luther King's own son, Dexter Scott King, arguing that Johnson was the decisive participant in that plot.
Well, he said that on national
ABC
TV, people. Dexter
Yeah.
King and the King family in 1997 on ABC News on national TV implicated Lyndon Johnson in the plot to murder John Kennedy. That's a fact. Now, whether LBJ did it or did not do it, the King family said he did it. They believe that.
And to go deeper into that pattern of corroboration, the King family is not chock full of crazy conspiracy theorists. These are not just credible people who lived at the heart of the civil rights movement. They were talking while in the middle of a civil trial that was relitigating the assassination of Martin Luther King. And in that trial, which was King family versus Jowers, the civil court found in favor of the King family, which is to say the court found in what I think really was the trial of the century that Martin Luther King was killed by a conspiracy.
And well, I think maybe this history is kind of suppressed, maybe because these gatekeepers in the historical profession want to uphold the mantra of American exceptionalism, this idea that America had this pure democracy, and we don't have these Caligula type figures. Although now Trump, it's kind of quite in the open. His crudeness has really off-put a lot of people. My question maybe to Robert is, can you say something more about LBJ's character, his crudeness, his disgusting nature, and how somebody like this, I mean, it's an embarrassment if somebody like this becomes a president of a great nation. So go ahead.
No. Crude is not the word. Disgusting is not the word. Lyndon Johnson was malignantly narcissistic criminal psychopath and a pathological liar. Okay. He was.
Now tell us what you really think.
Yeah.
I'll go you one further, Robert. Joachim Yosten calls him the Hitler of our time in 1968.
Well, I'll go you one further, Matt Armstrong.
Go.
In 1970, LBJ goes to a reunion at San Marcos State Teachers College. He's sitting around with his professors. He's being secretly taped. And he talked about his first Hitlerized operation, which was cheating to take over the student body at college in 1929. He said the word Hitlerized. He said it was my first Hitlerized operation. You got that?
That's actually really interesting, right?
And wait, we have to bring in the animals' rights people. As a child, in I guess elementary school or grammar school, he blew up a dog with a stick of dynamite.
Well, he was not in elementary school when he did that. I mean, most 6-year-olds can't break into the highway department and steal sticks of dynamite. Generally, that's a teenager job. And so he did that when he was about 18 years old in the year 1926. They were stealing dynamite from the highway department, because they have to blow up the areas to put a road through, right? So Lyndon Johnson at that age strapped a stick of dynamite to a live stray dog and blew the dog up in the town square of Johnson City. And that comes from a professor at the University of Texas who grew up with Lyndon Johnson, who told that to Bar McClellan. Okay.
If I may add one thing here, if we're going to talk about Johnson as a Hitler figure, I think we have to go further than just saying one journalist calls him a Hitler, and Johnson even himself compares himself favorably to a Hitler. And of course, he has these serial killer attributes like cruelty to animals. Yes. And he's the orchestrator of all these domestic murders. I think, sort of in an age where we're throwing the word or the name Hitler around very loosely, if we're going to really talk about Hitler, we have to talk about genocide. And when you look at Johnson as a social engineer, when you look at him as a neo-Nazi, when you look at him as the orchestrator of genocide, you have to bring in, I think, these larger conversations about Vietnam and the 2 million dead there and the chemical weapons deployed there. Think Agent Orange. And I think you also have to go to a place where very few people go, which is Indonesia.
Yes.
Right? Lyndon Johnson totally reversed the foreign policy prerogatives of John F. Kennedy when it comes to Vietnam, when it comes to keeping Israel from getting a nuclear weapon. And of course, when it comes to Indonesia, where Kennedy had a good, not perfect, but a good relationship with Sukarno. Johnson gets in office, totally reverses that position, and funds through the CIA the murder of 500,000 to 1 million Indonesian communists over the course of
Whoa,
a
whoa, whoa,
year.
whoa, 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 whoa!
Wait,
Use the word communist. How about using the word people?
I know.
Okay.
I think you're absolutely right.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean,
should-
okay,
I should
you're
put
falling
communist
you're
in
falling
air
into the
quotes.
propaganda. Woo,
No,
woo,
you're
woo.
right. That's a very good
Okay.
point.
if I
500,000
can make a
That's a very
point,
good point.
Go
I
ahead.
think there was some I would refer listeners to my book, Modernizing Repression, because I think actually the Kennedy administration was supporting covert programs through the USAID Office of Public Safety. So I do agree with Matt in general, but I don't think Johnson totally reversed all of Kennedy's policy. There was a lot of continuity across the administration, but Johnson did take it to the next level. I mean, in Vietnam, it was Kennedy who ordered the Operation Ranch Hand, the chemical warfare. But I do generally agree that Johnson's foreign policy was completely callous and a coordinator of genocide. Vietnam can be considered a genocidal type war, and he was kind of, I think, had no regard for human life. And actually, a question maybe to Robert is his role in orchestrating the USS Liberty false flag operation. That's often not understood, how LBJ was behind that. It was not the Israelis. They
No.
were just kind of used as pawns. Can you say
Correct.
something about
Okay.
that?
This is another critically important thing. So if people want to read about the USS Liberty very quickly, you can Google Judy Morris USS Liberty Substack. You'll get her article from 2012 about Lyndon Johnson orchestrating the attack on the USS Liberty. The USS Liberty was a U.S. intelligence ship that LBJ and a small handful of American plotters set up to be off the coast of Israel so that their co-conspirators, yes, it was a conspiracy in Israel, particularly Moshe Dayan, head of the Israeli Defense Forces, could sink an American ship in silence and quiet, and they could blame it on Egypt, and that would give the United States and LBJ a pretext to launch military action against Nasser of Egypt and remove him from power. That's what the USS Liberty was about. It was not about an American spy ship that was spying on Israel. That's just ludicrous. Lyndon Johnson was completely in bed with 200 hardcore Zionist Jews. He doesn't care what Israel is doing on the beach, whether they're massacring Arabs or whatever. That's not the deal at all. They wanted to sink an American ship and blame it on Egypt and then take out Nasser. And we almost had World War III. We almost had nuclear war with the Russians. They had to get on the hotline, and hotline was not a phone; it was a teletype. And they had to get on the hotline and teletype with LBJ and tell him to quit doing this and to quit, being provocative and do not attack Egypt. And if you do that, we're going to make a little smoking, flame out of Israel if you do that. That's how close we came to nuclear war, because we almost bombed Egypt, and that would have provoked a bomb from Russia onto Israel. And so the Israelis were idiots going along with this madman in the White House. So you're saying, Robert, is Lyndon Johnson a madman? What's your source on that? Do you have anybody credible who can tell you about this? Yeah, how about McGeorge Bundy? You ever heard of him? He was Lyndon Johnson's and JFK's national security advisor. And around 1970, the same time LBJ was bragging about his first Hitlerized operation. What were his other ones? George Bundy privately was telling Arthur Schlesinger, and this quote did not come out until the year 2005 or 6, when Schlesinger's diary was published by his son. Schlesinger says, well, a book has been written by Khrushchev, and he talks about Stalin and being how nutty and crazy he was and dangerous and maniacal and murderous. And he says that reminds me a lot of Hitler. That's what Schlesinger said. And then McGeorge Bundy says, well, I can think of somebody else who it reminds me of. It reminds me of my last days with Lyndon Johnson in the White House. Now, McGeorge Bundy had resigned as National Security Advisor in 1966 for LBJ, but he was brought back in June of 1967 to manage the U.S. response to the Six-Day War. That was McGeorge Bundy's last moments in the Johnson White House. And he's describing him as a Hitler or Stalin type character privately to Schlesinger 3 years later in 1970, privately. Okay? That's McGeorge Bundy. He's a pretty smart guy. McGeorge Bundy, like, I don't know if you know this, he scored a perfect score on his college boards. Okay? He was like the youngest dean of Harvard ever when he's in 31 or 32. He's whip smart. And then Kennedy picks him to be his national security advisor. And then after JFK is murdered by Lyndon Johnson, and I think Bundy knew that. Okay, he's not that stupid. He's very smart. I think he knew that LBJ had just murdered Kennedy. He stays on as the advisor. And then several years later, of course, Bundy, like McNamara and LBJ, are architects of the Vietnam War. So he ain't that smart. But he's calling Johnson to be like Hitler or Stalin privately.
Well,
That's the
a lot
source.
of Johnson's own aides said he was among the worst human being. I mean, he would humiliate his staff, and just even in his private dealing with people, he was just an absolute monster.
He's a monster. He was sick, sadistic, evil, vile. I mean, just erase the word
Cruel,
crude
yeah. They said he was
from the
known for his
conversation.
cruelty.
It's
to
not
regular
about
people.
being crude or disgusting or being from a country boy from Texas where they do that kind of stuff. No, he was a vicious, mean, cruel, disgusting psychopath.
Yeah,
And he would abuse Lady Bird.
He was cruel to his wife. He would have affairs right in front of his wife. He stuck his hand up a woman's skirt right in front of his wife. And
go ahead, Matt Armstrong.
Go ahead, Matt.
I just wanted to return to the Liberty for a second, because I think for a lot of people, this may be the first time they've ever heard about it. And I'd like to ground it for a moment in something that I think is both personal but also consequential for why we should care about this today. So I've got a friend of my family's named Nick Narangis. He was serving in the Navy at that time, and was in Norfolk at that time at Command Center when it happened. After the USS Liberty, like a lot of men in the Navy who were connected to that attack, Nick Narangis left the military. He was so disgusted by Johnson's behavior. And think of, Johnson's words at that time: I don't care about a few dead soldiers. I will not embarrass my ally. His total disregard for American life, for the lives, of patriots, of our soldiers. Narangis leaves the military, starts a McDonald's franchise in Winchester, where I grew up. And, today he's an actor. But this is what Johnson's actions led to in our country: a vast disillusionment, not just in the anti-war movement. We're not just talking about hippies here. We are talking about people who are within the American military saying, I want nothing to do with this country. I want nothing to do with institutional America. Johnson is often held up as the god of institutional America and big government. But he murdered a USDA investigator. He murdered a sitting president. Lee Harvey Oswald was a government employee. Those 34 sailors, those were government employees. Think about what that kind of foreign policy does, what that kind of leadership does to our morale. I think you sometimes have to bring in stories like Nick Narangis's just to kind of ground this in the personal for those, those working class people on the ground who were watching their leadership and then walking away.
Oh, okay. You mentioned Oswald. LBJ murdered him. How do we know? I'm saying Lyndon Johnson murdered John Kennedy on a Friday, and he murdered Lee Harvey Oswald on a Sunday. Okay. The White House was demanding that there be a public transfer of the prisoner. And we have sources from the Dallas Police Department, and they have names, and they're on the public record about that. This was the murder of Oswald was a setup orchestrated by the Lyndon Johnson White House. How they got to Ruby, via what method to get him to do that, I don't know. But I will tell you this, Jack Ruby knew all the rich Texas oilmen in Dallas, Texas, all the guys who got hookers from him, all the guys who he set up high stakes poker games. He was their buddy, their pal, their chum. Okay. He was a very good friend of Gordon McClendon. Do you know who Gordon McClendon was? He owned a radio station in Dallas. He was very good friends with, guess who? CIA David Atlee Phillips, who confessed to his family before he died that he was involved in the JFK assassination. Gordon McClendon was one of the founders of the Association of Former Intelligence Officers, AFIO. McClendon and David Atlee Phillips founded that in the 1970s because the CIA was taking so much heat for possible involvement in the JFK assassination. That's why they founded that. And the guy who killed Oswald was best chums with one of these covert operators. Do you see how how that happened? And so LBJ is calling down to Dallas on Saturday, telling Will Fritz, the head of detectives, quit interviewing Oswald, quit searching for other people. You found your man. Just shut up, stop it. And then the White House is asking for a public transfer of the prisoner. Okay, that's a setup. And then when he gets shot, Lyndon Johnson personally calls Parkland Hospital into the emergency room where there's a doctor on the phone right next door, Charles Crenshaw, and says, I would like to have a confession from the accused assassin. He didn't say, I would like to ask him who's involved in the conspiracy or who sent you or why'd you do this. I just want a confession from the accused assassin. Folks, it's blatantly obvious that Lyndon Johnson murdered John Kennedy and he murdered Lee Harvey Oswald too. And
I think one of the points you're making there, Robert, that doesn't get made enough is that Johnson was a micromanager.
Yes.
Right? We often think of the CIA in this case as the micromanagers and the social engineers, and Johnson is just this distant figure. He's a hick. He's largely an idiot. No, he's not an idiot. He's the supreme coalition builder of his time in Congress. According to Roger Stone recently, what did he say? That Johnson was in fact the paymaster of the CIA while in Congress.
Sure.
And when it comes to these attacks that we're talking about, whether we're talking about Oswald or the USS Liberty, there is Johnson on the microphone in the command center giving the order. There is Johnson in Parkland Hospital giving the order. This is a micromanager. This is, I'm not saying the only orchestrator, but he's an orchestrator.
By 1975, we found out that Lyndon Johnson had called Will Fritz, the chief of detectives for the Dallas Police Department, and says, quit interviewing Oswald, quit investigating other people. You have your man. And Will Fritz told this at a lunch of his close friends in the Dallas Police Department, and people were there and they witnessed that. And it was published in Penn Jones's Forgive My Grief. We've known that since 1975. And then when Charles Crenshaw came out, we know that Lyndon Johnson himself personally called the emergency room and wanted Oswald to give a confession. He didn't say, who sent you? Are you a Russian spy? Are you or did Fidel Castro kill Kennedy? Or did the mob do this? He just wanted him to confess, die, and LBJ could sweep it under the rug. One more thing. Lyndon Johnson hated Martin Luther King. Okay, hated him. In January of 1964, King comes to Washington, D.C. to meet with LBJ. He stays at the Willard Hotel. The FBI tapes the sexual shenanigans of Martin Luther King and other black preachers, and one of them is virtually raping a woman, and King is encouraging him on in January of 1964. LBJ, through Walter Jenkins, told the FBI, release this to the media, the national media. Lyndon Johnson was trying to destroy Martin Luther King in January of 1964, long before the Civil Rights Act was passed, and he signed it in July of 1964. After that, Pat, the media got all this stuff from LBJ and Hoover and did not print it. But we know it was released because Bob Novak, a prominent journalist who knew LBJ, in his autobiography said, "We got the info. We got the sex dirt on King from the FBI. It was released to the media." But the media was pro-civil rights, and they refused to print it. Then, I'm almost done filibustering. In the fall of '64, King is going to go accept the Nobel Peace Prize over in Europe. J. Edgar Hoover and William Sullivan of the FBI concoct a letter to King. They mail him the sex tapes, the audio of it. It's very disgusting, very ugly, very embarrassing to King. And they send him a letter suggesting that he commit suicide. And James Douglas talks about this in his recent book. They were trying to get MLK to kill himself. The Johnson administration and Hoover jointly were doing this stuff.
Let's fast forward, Robert. Let's fast forward to 1968.
Yes.
Right? You bring up James Douglas in his recent book, Martyrs to the Unspeakable. I think everybody should read it. It really paints a picture, again, of Johnson as a micromanager, but also as Johnson at war with Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy. And when you get to 1968, look at what's happening with King. He is joining forces. He's joining the civil rights movement with the anti-war movement. He's plotting with Bobby Kennedy a poor people's campaign, a march on Washington that is profoundly intersectional and that is going to set up a Hooverville at Johnson's back door. This is going to be a huge humiliation for Lyndon. They are basically going to be protesting poverty, as well as the war in Vietnam, challenging Johnson. You know, you have to choose. We're either going to have an empire or we're going to have a democracy. We're either going to take care of our people or we are going to be an empire that makes all of its treasure off of blood abroad and here at home. Of course, as we know, that never happens. King and Kennedy are both assassinated. But back to the point of Johnson as a micromanager. One of the things that Douglas brings up in this book is that Johnson, who's famous for very selflessly stepping away from the presidency in '68 to work for peace, had a plot. And the plot was that he was going to fly into Chicago after Bobby and Martin had been killed, and he was going to accept the nomination for president. And it was going to be offered through John Connally, and Johnson was going to return for another term. This was corroborated in the book, in Douglas's book, Martyrs to the Unspeakable, by Ed Daly. This is so important because we see Johnson at war with the civil rights movement, at war with the anti-war movement. These two movements were the only reason we didn't get another Johnson term. The chaos in Chicago that night, as those two communities were protesting and creating mayhem on the streets of Chicago, that was the only reason that Johnson didn't take off. His plane didn't take off and land in Chicago for this grand announcement.
Well, yeah.
Okay.
Oh, go ahead.
So go ahead. You go ahead, Jeremy.
No, if I had a question, but go ahead, Robert. If you had some points you wanted to
Okay,
add.
people who are listening are maybe confused. Like, Lyndon Johnson was running for president in '68. I didn't understand that. I thought he withdrew from the race in March of 31st of '68, and he wasn't running. Yeah, he did. And the real reason he did that was because Lady Bird was 100% against him running. His poll ratings were Gallup 38%. He was going to lose to Robert Kennedy in the Democratic primary. He was going to lose to Richard Nixon in the general election. He had a big L on his forehead. He was a loser, and he couldn't take that, so he withdrew. But after, then he spent the spring trying to get Nelson Rockefeller, a Republican governor of New York, to run for president because he hated Robert Kennedy so much. He wanted to get Nelson elected, and not Hubert Humphrey, but Warhawk, Nelson Rockefeller, and so he could beat Robert Kennedy. That's all LBJ cared about, was keeping Robert Kennedy out of the presidency, because he knew that Robert Kennedy knew he'd killed his brother. It was going to be a bad scene for LBJ, in January of '69 if Robert Kennedy were ever sworn in as president. Okay, so by the summer of '68, LBJ, Robert Kennedy was murdered June 5th of '68 in California. He is on track to win the Democratic nomination. He would have won that. And if anybody who questions you on this says, well, Humphrey had more delegates. These delegates were not in stone. They were controlled by big city mayors. William Daley was going to endorse Robert Kennedy and take along a truckload of northern big city mayors with him. They were going to nominate Robert Kennedy for president, not Hubert Humphrey. Hubert Humphrey thought he was dust. I'm going to lose, is what Hubert Humphrey says. It's over with. Bobby has won California. Daley's going to endorse him. He's going to take the big city mayors along with him who were previously supporting Humphrey and vote and support Kennedy. Johnson's so maniacal that by late July or early August of '68, he's telling John Connally and his number one henchman, Marvin Watson, I want you to go to the Southern Democrats, the most conservative, hardcore ones who used to love me when I'm a hardcore racist, and ask them, what do you think about nominating me? Mr. Unpopular Vietnam War. They all just started throwing up in the trash cans and projectile vomiting at the thought of nominating Lyndon Johnson. Okay, and they had to go tell Connally and Marvin Watson, you guys are nuts. We're not going to do this. Tell Johnson to shut up. Are you guys insane? But LBJ was just dying to fly in there, and I'm going to be in Chicago with Daley, and I'm going to be the nominee, and I'm whatever. It's crazy talk, but that's what he was trying to do. One little tidbit about him being a micromanager of all of his crimes. Sean Feder, who's an author on, the JFK assassination, he once quoted Rufus Youngblood to me. That's LBJ's Secret Service agent, who said, Lyndon Johnson would micromanage you twisting a screwdriver and a screw and tell you, turn it over, turn it to the right, keep going, keep going. He would micromanage everything. So I'm done.
I just have a couple of questions. It seems that you're talking about his relationship with Rockefeller. If you're going to take out a president, there's a lot of loose ends. Even if you are, kind of at the head of it, you have to know that the culture that you are in also supports that, because there's a lot of loose ends. What do you think about a larger conspiracy that's even beyond Johnson? It may not be provable. You definitely have some good forensics with Johnson, but is there a wider net?
You mind if I start with this one, Robert?
Go ahead, Matt.
Yeah. I think, Gloria, you make a really good point. And I think if we focus too much on Johnson, we lose track of the fact that there were multiple conspiracies to kill Kennedy at the time of his assassination. And this is what makes the field so confusing for a lot of people. There were far right-wing groups like the John Birch Society, the Minutemen, the Ku Klux Klan, right, who were plotting Kennedy's murder. There were folks in the CIA who wanted Kennedy dead. There were anti-Castro Cubans who wanted Kennedy dead. He was at war with corporate America. All of these people wanted Kennedy dead, and the mafia should also be thrown in there. The large question comes to who can really pull off this feat of social engineering, right? Who can pull off a coup d'etat? And I think Johnson is one of these figures, but there's no way he can do it without the help of an Allen Dulles, who he brings in to be the key investigator for the Warren Commission, without friends like the Rockefellers, without friends like H.L. Hunt, who I think, and Robert and I disagree on this, but I think H.L. Hunt, the richest man in America at that time, and somebody who was systemically funding a lot of these far-right groups at the time of the assassination who were plotting Kennedy's assassination. I think H.L. Hunt was one of the paymasters of the hit.
That's something Billy Celesta suggests in his book.
Yeah.
Well, let me quote John Connolly here. You ever heard of John Connolly? Longtime LBJ friend, buddy, pal, henchman from the 1930s, governor of Texas. He said after the assassination, the rumor mill was flying hard. People were saying two people were involved, H.L. Hunt on one hand and Lyndon Johnson on the other. Okay? I go by evidence. I know Lyndon Johnson did it. Okay, I'm not going to go into debate whether H.L. Hunt was involved or not. May have been, may not have been. But hate is not enough. You know, Jimmy Hoffa hated Kennedy. Carlos Marcello hated Kennedy. But on the ride back from Dallas, Jackie Kennedy did not say Jimmy Hoffa killed JFK. She turned to her press secretary, Pamela Tanur, who was, by the way, was a mistress of John Kennedy, and she said, quote, Lyndon Johnson did it. Because she'd just seen his unhinged behavior on that very plane. When they walked in, he has commandeered her bedroom on the plane, and he's hysterical. LBJ is hysterical, saying, conspiracy, conspiracy, they're going to kill us all, conspiracy. And then,
well, Robert, if I may push back, you have Senator Maureen Neuberger on the very day of the assassination saying that H.L. Hunt was.
Well, John Connolly just told you that a lot of people thought H.L. Hunt did it, but I don't want to debate. I don't want to debate that. That's micro to me. Okay.
Okay. Fair enough.
But back to Gloria's original question: was there a broader conspiracy? No. It was Lyndon Johnson, the rich guys in Texas, and some guys in the military and the CIA who killed Kennedy. It wasn't like the whole Joint Chiefs of Staff. It wasn't the freaking mafia. They had nothing to do with it. It was Johnson, Byrd, Ed Clark, who admitted it, and probably some other rich guys in Texas who we can't pin it on because we don't have any evidence on them, like maybe George Brown of Brown and Root, who was very close to Lyndon Johnson. We don't have any proof Brown was involved, but he was so close to LBJ, he would have had to have known that Johnson did it or been involved himself, and Brown was a CIA asset. I don't think Nelson Rockefeller was involved in killing Kennedy. I don't think Allen Dulles was. Two key points, though. Their friend, General Edward Lansdale, was involved. Lansdale was the protege of Allen Dulles from the 1940s when he found the stolen gold in the Philippines by torturing the chauffeur of one of the Japanese generals. Lansdale was involved in torture, okay? Lansdale is friends with Nelson Rockefeller. Personal friends, okay, and God knows who else. Nelson Rockefeller was deeply involved in U.S. intelligence in the 1950s, and especially was involved in Latin American affairs because he had oil interests and economic interests down there. I just don't think that Nelson Rockefeller is going to kill Kennedy. Johnson had to because he was about to be destroyed by the Kennedys, and he figured out who in the military, Lansdale, David Atlee Phillips, maybe E. Howard Hunt, maybe some others, David Morales, who's going to come along with him to kill Kennedy. And he found his boys and he killed him. But I don't indict the steel industry or the Federal Reserve in murdering John Kennedy. I indict Lyndon Johnson and the rich guys in Texas, because that's what LBJ said. LBJ himself said it was the rich guys in Dallas, that's his own words to Madeline Brown, and renegade intelligence bastards who killed Kennedy. Except, yeah, go ahead.
I hate to say this, but
not the top CIA people, the renegade agents.
We got to wrap it up. So I'd like to just give Matt and Robert a chance to tell our audience how they can follow your important work and purchase your books.
Gloria, thank you so much for having us. Jeremy, thank you again for having us. Jayme, you too. You can find me on X at MC Armstrong, and I've got an investigative memoir about my time embedded with Joint Special Operations Forces in Iraq called The Mysteries of Editha, a young adult novel called American Delphi, and a work of scholarship on sort of profiles and courage within the post 9/11 soldier writer community. Think Edward Snowden. That is called Veteran Activism in the Global War on Terror. So thank you very much for having us. That's how you can find me.
Okay, I want to tell folks, don't worry about following me. We left out another gargantuan crime of Lyndon Johnson, which is that Lyndon Johnson stole 6 million troy ounces of gold from White Sands Missile Range in the 1960s. And Richard Nixon followed up by stealing 37 tons of gold in 1973 using the same operatives. You can read about that massive crime, in John Clarence's trilogy of books on Amazon.com called the Gold House Trilogy, volumes 1, 2, and 3. The Gold House by John Clarence, for sale on Amazon.com. Get that book. You know, Lyndon Johnson was such an unhinged criminal. We did not even mention that in a whole hour. He stole 6 million ounces of gold. Multiply 6 million ounces of gold by the current price of gold right now, and have a mind blow. Thank you.
Well, the opinions you hear are ours and that of our guests, not those of WBAI, the Pacifica Foundation, or the Progressive Radio Network. That wraps up our show for today. This is Uncontrolled Opposition. I'm Gloria Guillo, joined here by Professor Jayme Kuzmarov. Remember to like and share our broadcast. Your kind support keeps us going. Please find us on Substack, Twitter X, and Podbeam. Thanks for tuning in. Hope to see you next week.
Hey, I had a great time, folks.
Thanks. That was a great show. Yeah,
We're still live. If you want to.
I got to go teach, unfortunately. You guys keep talking, but I got to go teach. Gloria, thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Matt.
Fantastic show. Really
fun. I'm sure we'll get
Great
a lot of positive feedback. So, yeah, please spread the show around, promote it.
You got it.
Yes.
And I had two questions.
Go ahead.
If we had time. One was, well, I've got to go too in 5 minutes. So my two questions was, one, if you think LBJ was involved in the murder of RFK because he had a clear motive. And the second was just about the LBJ library and more on how historians have tried to burnish his image.
Oh, Jayme, how about we talk on the phone here in the next couple of days? I'd love to talk about that.
Okay.
But I do think he was behind RFK.
Yeah, it would make sense.
Right. I'll talk to you guys
soon.
Take
care.
Bye.
Take care, Matt.
Okay.
And, yeah, I have to leave in like.
Okay. Well, usually Jayme comes back in. Hey, Jayme.
Okay, go ahead.
There he is. There's our guy.
I don't know if Robert, you want to briefly touch on those two?
Yeah, I will. Okay. Robert Kennedy was killed by a singular man, a lone nut named Sirhan, who was a Christian Palestinian who was extremely enraged at Robert Kennedy coming out for fighter jets for Israel and considered that a personal betrayal to him. And after the assassination of Kennedy, he asked his jailers about a little fringe anti-Israel group in New York City, how they were reacting to his act. And then he asked his jailers to don't tell anybody that I said this. That's what Sirhan said. Did I do good, guys? And he didn't want his jailers to know that he was inquiring about this hardcore anti-Israel group. Remember, the 6-Day War just occurred the day before. So no, Lyndon Johnson partied like it was 1999 when Kennedy got killed, Robert Kennedy. He also tried to keep a brain surgeon from going to Los Angeles, but I don't think he orchestrated his death. That's just my opinion.
Okay, and the briefly, and I have to leave, but at 11:15. But the LBJ library and the historian, how they try and burnish his image, and how a lot of what we're discussing today has been suppressed from history books.
Well, it's because it's an extreme national embarrassment to the establishment. I keep telling people that the truth about the JFK assassination is like a cannonball being shot into the belly of the American establishment. Whether it's the presidents themselves, Johnson, who did it, Ford, who covered it up, George Walker Bush, who knew the truth, Richard Nixon, who knew the truth, or whether it was the government itself, a military general being involved, Lansdale, U.S. intelligence being involved, the FBI covering it up, the handmaidens of the U.S. media, friends of these murderers covering it up. The JFK assassination truth blows them all away. in the belly. That's why they cover it up.
Okay, well, I'm going to have to run, guys. Thank you,
Yeah.
Robert. It's always a pleasure, and I've learned a lot from you. So you're
Thank
really highly knowledgeable on this topic.
Great time. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jeremy. Well,
Take care,
why don't we
guys.
just go ahead and wrap up the show unless you have another question, Gloria.
No, we're good.
Okay. Well, then we'll just wrap it up. Thank you, Jeremy. And thanks everybody who's watching at home. This is Uncontrolled Opposition. Our executive producer is Craig Postitos Jardula. So thanks to him. And this has been another episode. Thanks to our guests, Robert and Matt. It's been this is a great topic, and my thoughts are like, I didn't know how bad LBJ was, and then you got to compare who's worse, him or Trump. I mean, this Trump, like, I don't think Trump, the first part of Trump was that bad with respect to other presidents we've had, but this term of Trump has been just a roller coaster ride of just a nightmare. But like against the LBJ, I mean, I don't know who's worse. What do you think?
I think that would make a good topic of an article.
All right, I'm gonna head out, guys.
Well,
Thanks.
there's still more to come with Trump, so one day when we can get a real comparison. All right, thanks everybody.
Okay.
We're gonna get out of here, and we'll see you next week with another episode. Have a good one.
You